what's special about Sikhi? The special part about Sikhi is how it basically takes that wisdom and then applies it to your everyday transactional reality, your daily life kind of thing. Like, how do you reconcile the deep wisdom while staying within society? Topics like statecraft and politics actually become relevant for a Sikh, because that's your opportunity to take your wisdom and apply it to reality. But actually, instead of going and retreating into like forests or whatever, stay within society, become like a lotus and become like a beacon in society kind of thing, like enact justice in the world. And this is where I kind of like orient what the Khalsa's purpose is, what the point of Sikhi is, what makes Sikhi unique, is a unique interaction between the philosophy of non-duality and then its application within duality. What we're trying to do is replicate what Guru Gobind Singh Ji themselves had done by crafting the Anandpur darbar, where they invited wisdom from all over, the most relevant, the most advanced, in many topics, the diversity of topics they had, the diversity of individuals they had contributing to it. And that whole environment which they created in Anandpur essentially allowed a Sikh intelligentsia to arise. And that in turn forged the mindsets of the next generations of Sikhs and Khalsa, who went on to establish the first like Sikh republics, Misls, kingdoms. So the Khalsa, who were learning from the Anandpur darbars, learned a lot about statecraft in a kind of monarchistic empire kind of world order model kind of thinking. But then the Guru sort of like threw a bombshell and said, okay, well, now you're all kings. And they're all trying to reconcile now, like, well, if we're all kings, what does that mean? Like, how do we set up a society or a civilization or governance structures if we're all kings, if we're all equal? And the kind of like conclusion they sort of seemed to come up with was this idea of a Misl system, where like, cool, we have the benefits of having a hierarchy and a king structure and the kind of like benefits that come with that, but we don't just have one king that rules over all of us, because no one is more king than anyone else. We'll just have a system where you have many of these kings. They form their own groups called Misls. And I don't think they called themselves Misls during that time. I think that's a later thing that we started attributing to them. But essentially these look like confederacies and kind of like autonomous kind of units who took over various regions in Punjab, and they imposed a tax, a Rakhi, a kind of protection tax, and they basically provided the defense for the people within their jurisdiction. That's largely what they did. I mean, they had like they patronized the arts and like helped the society here and there, but they were largely quite minarchist. Like they were kind of like hands off with this, as far as I understood it. And then one of them towards the western side of Punjab, they were sort of ran by this one Misl who got fed up by the Afghan invasions, that they were taking the brunt of it. So they sort of like went and did this process of centralizing the Misls into a unified kingdom. And that guy came to be known as Maharaja Ranjit Singh. So they set up the first Sikh kingdom. Now, I personally think that was a mistake. I don't think they should have done that, because now they put all their eggs in one basket with this one guy, and then they sort of rely on the competency and the benevolence of this one guy and his sort of like small group around him to administer the kingdom in a way that's effective. And what does that say about my autonomy as an individual? We have to be subordinate to him. And this is why even during Maharaja Ranjit Singh's time, like the Khalsa would not respect him a lot. Like they'd actually scare Maharaja Ranjit Singh quite a bit, and they would actually be a good counterweight. And it's probably one of the reasons why the Sikh Empire was so successful. To his credit, he did a very good job. Like, it was a very good successful system. But again, it relied on him. So as soon as he went off the scene, the system that relied upon him also collapsed. Well, I like the decentralization of the Misls more than I like the centralized format of the Sikh Empire, because one, I think, is more philosophically consistent with what I think Guru Gobind Singh Ji's vision was, to decentralize the Guruship amongst the Khalsa as a whole, and where people can actually decide for themselves which hierarchy they like to join voluntarily. And if that hierarchy, that Misl, no longer has a mutually beneficial relationship, they can leave and join another Misl or even start their own. That, I think, is philosophically better from a Sikh and Khalsa point of view. The Misl system before had two major problems that made it susceptible to being centralized in the first place by Maharaja Ranjit Singh. The first thing, there's not enough of them. Instead, cooperate and coordinate together, and maybe in a single city-state or a single town, you might have hundreds of Misls operating, serving many different clients. Interlace, and you form a network of security by having so many security providers offering bespoke security services to the citizenry there. So that's essentially what I believe for a modernized Misl system. Azardism is a political economic ideology that I made up to basically encapsulate my ideas on freedom as applied to economics, based it on Sikhi and Khalsa ethos, etc. And it's meant to be a guiding philosophy on how you'd actually perform statecraft from a Sikh perspective. But with Stanistan, what I wanted to do was make a land of lands, a system of systems where people can actually form their own communities voluntarily based on characteristics or values or whatever they want to do for themselves. And then those systems will compete with each other on the basis of providing good quality of life for people. So those systems that are able to produce the best governance structures, they can basically perform the best to attract the most talent to their societies, and those talent will then contribute to their society to grow the society further if they so choose to. These teams will come together, they will pool funds amongst each other, they'll attract investors, they'll attract donations, etc. They'll buy some land and they'll basically set it up from scratch. And then over time, we can see from a range of experiments which one of these experiments is more successful for their own stated success metrics. Even having this idea of what success is, it might be different to each person. That's not an objective measure either. Like some people might think, oh, success is having a life where I can eat healthy food. So the commune might be set up to basically focus on organic farming, like an eco-village kind of thing, right? And we have examples of these as well in small pockets as well around the world, is that one stan can't negatively impact another stan without their consent. And that's where I believe the Khalsa missile system comes in. We've lost that Sikh Intelligentsia who are able to craft the mindsets that make people ready to actually engage in statecraft and politics and Rajniti effectively. So my aim with setting up this think tank was to take that inspiration and revive and do our part, our small contribution to revive that legacy, revive the Sikh Intelligentsia, so that we can create a kind of Vijar repository for the next generation, so they can have something to work from as a solid foundation. So if they're going to go into doing politics, they're not doing so blindly based on emotion, but they're doing it based on rationality. Like emotion is great for bhakti, right? When you're doing kirtan, when you're doing simran, right? Emotion's great then. You want to become extremely emotional, you want to become irrationally emotional. But when it comes to when you're operating within duality, then a different mindset is required. You should become rational, right? That's what rationality is required. So it's about understanding, okay, where does different modes of thinking become relevant? And then what does that give you? And so a think tank is about a highly rational approach to statecraft, a realistic, a pragmatic approach that understands reality for what it is, so that if we understand the problem, we have a better capacity to solve the problem. Because if you can't accurately define the problem, you're not going to find an accurate solution to a problem. And the reason why I believe it's important to have this kind of elitism within Sikh civilization and culture isn't because I believe we should form kind of like a pseudo caste hierarchy. It's because the whole point of, in my opinion, what Sikh was trying to do, what the gurus are trying to do, was elevate the peasant to the status of a king and a warrior. Right? So to become aristocratic, to become high society, is the kind of like point of becoming Khalsa. The Khalsa automatically elevates themselves to the status of a king. So having this high culture and engaging in high culture is actually part and parcel of being Khalsa. And the unique thing about Sikh aristocracy is that anybody can be one. It's only your own actions that define whether you're going to behave like a high-class individual or you're going to behave like a low-class, low-intellect, low consciousness individual. So there's the kind of like that element of luxury. But a Khalsa should be in a way where they're comfortable both on like a throne and also a horse's saddle kind of thing, right? They should be comfortable in a palace and also a jungle. So the Khalsa has that kind of like flexibility to them. But yeah, there's a very important place, I think, for Sikh aristocratic culture, Sikh high society, elite culture, because that is what the Guru was trying to do, is trying to make the common man into an elite. And that was also a political move as well as a spiritual move, because it's sort of saying, okay, no one is actually above anybody. In reality, we're all equal. If they can be king, so can you be a king. And to do that, you have to shift in the mindset. So if you detest kingly things, then you're not going to be a king, right? You should have a kind of moderation with, there's a balance with it. Even this concept of mukti, like you just mentioned now, the Nordic country, that they don't seem, if you go there or if you look at their governments, whatever, they're prioritizing mukti in society. They've not got like a spiritual centers set all over the place, like financed by the government. It's like because like mukti, right, and then this yearning for like spiritual progression and like spiritual excellence, it's not something you attain. It's something that's natural with everybody. What you're trying to do is reduce the inhibitions to it. Now, there's a philosopher, Alan Watts, right, and he does a really good example of like how happiness is looked about in the West versus the East. And he goes, in the West, they look at happiness as something you attain, as external to yourself, so you must attain happiness. But in the East, it's more like, no, happiness is already inside you. You've got to remove the barriers to it. So the West becomes a bit more like, okay, we have to go outwards and seek happiness externally. where in the East they started to seek happiness by doing internal inquiry, philosophy, meditation, spiritual practice, etc. Right? And it's a very similar thing then with freedom as well. Like freedom is the natural state of things, diversity is the natural state of things. If you want more of those things, you want more prosperity and growth and innovation, then reduce the barriers to it, and then you'll start having those things. And I think Sikhi is very unique in that. Is like one of the kind of like it's very individualistic, because what individualism really is, it pertains to rights. It's not necessarily saying are you selfish or you're not selfish, which I think people misunderstand it as. But with individualism, what it does, it pertains to rights. Like, what rights does the individual have? Like, does he have the autonomy to make his own decisions? And the way Sikhi, I think, does it is that it respects individualism more so than anyone else. Now, when it comes to like, okay, well, how do you form communities whilst having an individualistic culture? Is that what you do is that you don't have one community, you have many communities, and you give the right to each individual to decide which community they like to participate in. And they should also have the freedom to set up their own community. So instead of having one overarching community that everyone must conform to, again, it's what nation states and nationalism did. Instead, you should have a system of systems where you create an environment which anybody can set up their own community based on anything they want to and attract like minds. And if they create situations and environments within their small community that is conducive to growth and prosperity and great standards of living that people want to move to and also participate in, then they'll start getting people migrating towards them, and then they'll set up and grow their community if they so choose to. But if you keep it broad and you accept the diversity and you allow for more freedom and individual autonomy, then your community is probably more likely to grow. Monopolies don't naturally form because it goes against nature. Because in nature, again, if you remember, right, it naturally tends towards diversity. It doesn't trend towards monopolization and centralization. It tends towards decentralization. So when you go to a jungle, right, a jungle is not just one tree. It's actually loads of species of trees, loads of biodiversity, loads of animals, insects. It's an extremely biodiverse environment. And it's the same thing with markets, right? If you leave markets alone, you end up with lots and lots of diversity, because anyone can enter the market, anyone can identify the problems in the market, and anyone can establish their own solutions to solve those problems. The issue becomes when you have a monopoly on violence in the market. So somebody in the market is basically deciding who can participate and who can't. We encourage the debate and disagreement, because if we set up a situation where we're all just being yes men, we ain't going to get anywhere. We're going to be lying to each other, deluding each other, and then not actually achieving anything. We've got to be actually quite accurate with what the reality is. And the only way we're going to be accurate with what the reality is if we do vigorous debate and vigorous research and honest, and be humble when we're wrong as well. So that is what basically how I envision a kind of free society that balances justice, but also individual autonomy and freedom, and also collectivism for people to form communities based on what they want, rather than what's being imposed upon them by a single system of government.
Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed today's cinematic. Before we dive into the podcast, I just want to take the time to ask you to please like and subscribe to this channel. This will help us grow the podcast, invite more guests on, and share their wisdom as we grow Illuminating Dialogues. I also want to share with you that I'm offering one-to-one coaching. This is a space where we navigate together to clarify your vision, align yourself to your values, and achieve transformation. If you feel called for that, you can book a session with me on my website, jhoty.com. There should be some testimonials as well there. The links are in the description below, and also there's a link for you to join our WhatsApp community as well, where you can discuss these episodes. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the podcast ahead. Hello everybody, and welcome to Illuminating Dialogues number 45, where I have the pleasure to sit down with Ranjit Singh from Bunga Azaadi today, not to be confused with Ranjit Singh from Sikh Empire. How's it going?
Oh yeah.
How's it going, man?
Yeah, all good, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me on. Looking forward to this. So hopefully it'll be a good conversation.
Yeah, thanks man for coming on. I've just been inspired by your work. We had a conversation before, and I'm just glad to sit down with you and have a kind of grounded conversation of the work you're doing. This dialogue so far has gone into many kind of avenues as I've been exploring, like metaphysics, Ayurveda from the Sikh lens, and we got more and more into the worldly understandings. And so I'm really keen to go down, why is statecrafting knowledge important in this path that we're on of becoming effectively sage warriors, how we can start to implement this in a community-based but also sovereign way, and kind of get into the worldly context that we're in now, the work you're doing, and how does a Bunga work, in the Guru's time, how did the Bunga work, and the work you're doing now as well. But before we get into that, I'd love to give a short introduction of the Bunga for the viewers who are not familiar. So Bunga Azaadi Institute for Azadist Studies is a think tank which applies a Sikh perspective to the modern world. With the rapid rate of innovations in technology and a constantly changing geopolitical landscape, it is imperative that we are conscious and evaluating the world around us to keep up to date. Bunga Azaadi produces and curates vichars from a network of individuals passionate about using Sikh wisdom to inform our positions so to navigate these challenging times and make informed decisions moving forward. So before we begin, this platform is called Illuminating Dialogues. It's really a space to have a dialogue, a flow of meaning, and maybe to journey to a place we both haven't gone before, and to illuminate ourselves and hopefully the listeners as well. So my first question to you is, what lights you up?
What lights me up?
Yeah.
my guru lights me up. Every morning I wake up, I remember the Guru, because that is literally what the Guru is, right? Is the enlightener. Like, it's not just a teacher, it is that light within the darkness. So yeah, everything we do as a Bunga, and I try to do as an individual, is illuminated by the Guru. So yeah, I guess the Guru will be my answer to that one.
Cool. Nice, man. That's a nice grounded answer. And what drives you? And I'm just wondering, like, off the back of that, if you can give us some context, like, what was your journey into, like, spirituality? Have you always been into Sikhi? How did you get into spirituality, and then how did that drive your motives behind statecrafting? Because that is a journey in itself.
Yeah, it's a good one. I mean, generally, I don't really like reveal too much about myself in general. So I will for the purpose of this interview, whatever, because I think it might be interesting. But I want to always try and make sure the ideas stand on their own grounds rather than the actual mouth it comes from. So I could be like a Japanese guy and saying the same things, and the ideas should hold on their own merit. But yeah, my sort of journey into this sort of stuff and why I've got involved with it and established the Bunga, etc. is I used to be Monna before. I never used to keep my case. I grew up in a traditional Punjabi family. Sikhi is more like a Sunday thing, and Punjabi culture is a bit more of a forefront. And then I think around secondary school, towards the end of secondary school, I used to get really interested into various topics. So I used to always fall into rabbit holes and all that kind of stuff, and just research things thoroughly. And one of the ones I was doing at that time was conspiracy theories. So I used to really enjoy conspiracy theories, all the 9/11 conspiracy theories, that kind of stuff. And whilst now my views on a lot of those stuff is a bit more moderated, I think what is good conspiracy theory type thinking is it starts to make you think a bit more critically about things, and stop taking things from face value, and start to really wrestle with things that you're being fed. And doing that, there's a whole strain in the conspiracy space, I guess, that is against kind of secret societies and elites kind of ruling the world behind the scenes kind of thing and doing evil. And it's that evil aspect that really especially when you're young, really hits you, and you want to fight and combat evil. And then when I start to put that into our own kind of Sikh context, I sort of see where is the evil present in our Panth that is that we're suffering as a community. And obviously quite prominently you'd quite quickly hear about the Khalistan movement and the 1984 genocide and that kind of stuff. So that's our kind of Panth interaction with evil in the modern times. So from that rabbit hole, I went into the Khalistan side rabbit hole, and I got really immersed in the Khalistan type stuff. So I guess the Khalistan whole way of thinking is what got me into Sikhi. So I was not really too much interested in like the spirituality and philosophy of Sikhi that much. I was more interested in the Khalistan stuff. And that kind of persisted for a while until I went to sixth form. And like sixth form, I had no Sikh Sangat. It was just basically me, the only Sikh, and around me were a lot of Muslims and Hindus and atheists. And so I was more like ideologically challenged then to actually defend my beliefs on philosophical grounds, like ideological, theological grounds. So that really changed my kind of priorities and perspectives. And around that time is when I also discovered Basis of Sikhi, and I got immersed in that content. Like Bhaji Garaj Singh is probably the biggest influence on me. And I used to like binge watch all his videos, every lectures, all that kind of stuff. Because for me, it was like, if I didn't learn the Sikhi stuff, I couldn't defend my beliefs in the debate with all the people around me, kind of thing. So it was a kind of trial by fire for those 2 years. But it really strengthened my Sikhi. And I ended up keeping case during that time. And then by the time I got to university, that was like my first proper like interaction with the Sikh Sangat properly. So the Sikh societies there, stuff I used to get involved with. They used to bring a lot of talkers and different events. So I used to really enjoy them, especially the debates. And like that's when I sort of first started discovering the kind of diversity I thought within Sikhi itself. So the kind of even the basics, it became a bit more advanced when learning about new perspectives from people I respected. And then that was when I sort of got put off a lot of the Khalistan stuff as well, because obviously Khalistan as well, like it's a big hype, like especially when you're young. When you start seeing literal results and progress, it starts to put you off a little bit, and then you start getting a bit more swayed by arguments like, "Oh, we can't even run a godwara, how are you going to run a nation state?" And you're like, "Yeah, that's a good point, actually." But it's like, so I got put off the kind of like political side of Sikhi, and just like put it in the backlog. I thought I'll deal with that later. It's not really interesting anymore. And that's when my sort of like philosophical exploration of Sikhi kind of like started to begin even more, and particularly around a couple of questions. One was like the nature of God itself. It was not just this concept of one God, kind of monotheistic interpretation, but more pantheistic or panentheistic interpretation of God that attracted me a lot, particularly the whole Sikhi's outlook on non-dualism. And then the implications of that. So the biggest implication of that is, what does that mean if God is everything, including myself, is also part of everything, including everyone else around us? And what does that sort of mean for an individual self? And what does that mean for an individual will, a sense of free will? Like surely isn't everything God's will? So around that time, I was also exposed to a lot of the ideas of someone called Sam Harris, kind of neuroscientist and philosopher. And he had quite popularized the kind of debate around free will versus determinism at the time. So I was trying to reconcile those deterministic arguments that I was persuaded by with my understanding of Sikhi, because when you read like Japji Sahib and stuff, obviously in some areas it will talk about having a free will, but then other areas it will talk about as if you have no free will, it's all hukum, it's all Maharaj doing everything. So it seems to be like a bit of a contradiction there. So how do we reconcile the two? So is that like kind of line of inquiry was basically what I spent like a yearish like wrestling with, like asking anyone I could, getting all the perspectives I could, before I sort of like finally settled on an answer, which was that, okay, ultimately there is no free will, the same way how ultimately there is no separate sense of self. That is also an illusion, and by extension of that illusion, you have the illusion of free will. But whilst you're in the illusion, whilst you're operating within duality, you kind of assume you have free will, right? You kind of pretend you play with the game, kind of thing. The same way we pretend we are separate selves. So that was kind of my like kind of a conclusion with that. And then around that same time, I also then came across there's a website called Mangla Jalan, run by Jawala Singh, and it's brilliant because it gives you a lot of the kind of rare parts of Sikh literature you don't actually tend to see quite often in the mainstream. And there was one page he had on his website about Shaheed by Mani Singh, Sikh Bhagat Malla. And it was actually addressing this specific question on free will. Like a couple of Sikhs went to Guru Dev and they asked him, Maharaj, you've got written here, everything's like our own actions, our own karma, and that has the effect. But here you're talking about everything's within hukum. Like, how do you reconcile these positions? And then Maharaj gives the answer, well, there's essentially how a doctor gives different medicines to each patient in a bespoke way. He's not going to give the same medicine to everyone because everyone has different kind of ailments. And the same way, Sikhi's a bit like that. Maharaj, the Guru, is the doctor, and he's prescribing the right kind of vidya or Sikhya, or the knowledge or wisdom per Sikh. Is a very personal thing to the Sikh. So there's like three general levels of competency Maharaj describes in that passage, and it's one is of karma, one is of upasana, kind of devotion, and the last one is of gyan, wisdom. And he goes at the gyan wisdom level, then yes, there is no free will, right? Some of these shabbats are going to be more resonate with those people at that level. But people at the competency of karma, competency of action, rituals, that kind of stuff, they're going to need to have be given the teachings that you have to perform good actions and avoid bad actions, that kind of stuff. There's a progression here, and then when you look at something like Gobind Gita by Guru Gobind Singh Ji, his version or his kind of transcreation of Bhagavad Gita, he also talks about these kind of similar three levels, and he puts it into like a progression hierarchy. So you start off at this kind of sort of competency of action, and through those actions you purify your actions and you get pure heart kind of thing. And then with a pure heart, you can do genuine bhakti, you can do genuine devotion to God. And then through genuine devotion, it becomes a kind of like that whole upasana state is a kind of transitory state where it takes you to wisdom. When you sort of, during upasana, you're saying, God, you do everything, you are everything, you, right? And then that Shabad comes to mind, tu karta, tu hua mujhe meherano. That one where Bhagat Kabir is basically sort of saying, by saying you, I become you, right? Nothing of me remains of myself. That is when you transition from that upasana competency to the gyan competency, when you recognize that God is everything. Even the self does not remain at that level because the self is an illusion. It's just all God. So that's kind of like, in a nutshell, my kind of answer to that. Like, it really resolved that dispute and that thing I was wrestling with in my head about the free will question. So the non-duality stuff was fine. And then also the free will versus determinist stuff came unlocked in my head. And then those are two basically big things for me philosophically to really question and do that inquiry on Sikhi itself. And after that, I came kind of bored because there's not really anything else that those kind of things couldn't really resolve, right? Like contradictions in Bani could be easily explained by, Maharaj is talking to people at different competencies, right? So then I was like, okay, well, how do I then apply this? Like, what is the point of Sikhi? Because what we've discovered there is that that's not very unique. Like, if you look at the Advaita Vedanta kind of monks and you listen to someone like Swami Sarvapriyananda on YouTube, he goes through like stuff like this. There's nothing unique. Like, you go to Buddhism, they'll talk about non-duality all the time as well. Like, there's nothing like what's special about Sikhi. And then the special part about Sikhi is how it basically takes that wisdom and then applies it to your everyday transactional reality, your daily life kind of thing. Like, how do you reconcile the deep wisdom while staying within society? And it's that part where naturally then topics like statecraft and politics actually become relevant for a Sikh, because that's your opportunity to take your wisdom and apply it to reality. Whereas other traditions tend to take that wisdom and then they retreat into the caves and the mountains and the forests just to meditate on it and then attain that kind of like non-dual states. Whereas the Sikh is a bit more like, well, okay, fine, do that, but actually instead of going and retreating into like forests or whatever, stay within society, become like a lotus and become like a beacon in society kind of thing, like enact justice in the world. And this is where I kind of like orient what the Khalsa's purpose is, what the point of Sikhi is, what makes Sikhi unique, is a unique interaction between the philosophy of non-duality and then its application within duality.
Wow. That's amazing. It's really inspiring to hear like how deep you went, like intellectually or like your own being, trying to like find out the praxis almost of like reality and then coming out the other end. Because what I found as well is like through my heart, like kirtan, connecting to my heart, and I'm like, okay, so a lot of cultures and traditions do this, but like how do we now, like it's almost like this now masculine element of like actually manifesting this in real life.
Yes.
And how do we actually do this? And I really like how you explain the different evolutions of consciousness, from Karam to Gyan, which is really interesting, and probably need to look into that more. So so in the world that we're in now, why is having a think tank and statecraft now important? Because how does this really differ from the current worldly narrative that we're in? So we looked into the Advaita Vedanta stuff, and that's cool. You can go in a cave. We talked to Dr. Kamarup before about 108 about having Guru Granth Sahib, Shunya, and Dasam Granth being one, Sarabhula Granth being infinity. And in the current worldly narrative that we're in, a lot of people are working 9 to 5. A lot of people are nation states. So we're under a capitalist Western narrative. We've got this Advaita narrative. Sort of, okay.
Yeah.
And then we've got now this think tank, statecraft kind of narrative. So why is having a think tank and statecrafting important?
Yeah, so the idea with a think tank was basically to try to take inspiration from the Anandpur darbars of Guru Gobind Singh.
Mm-hmm.
So I think even before I mention this point, I think it's important to understand why it's even necessary to engage in statecraft.
Okay.
And the reason why is because if we understand that Sikhi is a tradition which takes non-duality, extracts principles to be applied in duality, how does that sort of manifest? And for me, it's about enacting justice in this world. Like our purpose here is actually to reduce suffering and increase prosperity and freedom. And especially the ability for others to pursue a concept of mukti, right, or moksha, or shunya, or to get to satyug, or however you sort of want to put it. But it's giving the max amount of opportunity for the max amount of people to pursue their own destinies and attain enlightenment if they so choose to. Now, obviously, Sikh is born in a time where there's a lot of oppression from states and from all sorts of factors in society, etc. Right? And I think it's the duty of a Sikh and the duty of the Khalsa specifically to actually engage in reality to improve it. Now, obviously, in meditation, we'd recognize it's all Maharaja's play anyway, it's all God's play. But again, you don't operate continuously 24/7 on that mindset. You have to park it and actually play in the game a little bit. And your meditation's your opportunity to sort of step back and realize, okay, well, let's not get too attached here. It's still obviously God themselves are the evildoers. God themselves are the good guys as well. The gods on both sides here, right? But consciously, without a sort of free will, I believe I might have, I will choose to perform justice and on the good side. But again, you often realize it's a play. So if we separate that out and we say, okay, well, statecraft then and all the vichars related to politics it is uniquely for that state of mind where you're playing, where you're in the duality. And so how do we then play in the duality most effectively? And this is where something like a think tank like a think tank actually becomes quite relevant, because what we're trying to do is replicate what Guru Gobind Singh Ji themselves had done by crafting the Anandpur Darbar, where they invited wisdom from all over, the most relevant, the most advanced in many, many topics, the diversity of topics they had, the diversity of individuals they had contributing to it. And that whole environment which they created in Anandpur essentially allowed a Sikh Intelligentsia to arise. And that in turn forged the mindsets of the next generations of Sikhs and Khalsa, who went on to establish the first Sikh republics, Misls, kingdoms. And now when I'm looking around today and I'm saying, okay, well, why haven't we got a nation state yet as a Sikh community or any form of Raj? It doesn't have to be a nation state. Why is that? What are we lacking? And then it's quite obvious what we're lacking. We're lacking that Sikh Intelligentsia. That thing has been kind of destroyed over the last century. So when Sikhs today or Sikhs in modern times have attempted statecraft, it hasn't really resulted in any real success. And then we have to be honest with ourselves when we say that. Obviously, that doesn't mean there was no successes, but overall, our ambition to establish a kind of sovereign territory or a Satyug type experience, Satyug type of environment, that hasn't been successful so far. There is still mass suffering on a large scale. And the reason why I believe is because we've lost that Sikh Intelligentsia who are able to craft the mindsets that make people ready to actually engage in statecraft and politics and Rajniti effectively. So my aim with setting up this think tank was to take that inspiration and revive and do our part, our small contribution to revive that legacy, revive the Sikh Intelligentsia, so that we can create a kind of Vichar repository for the next generation so they can have something to work from as a solid foundation. So if they're going to go into doing politics, not doing so blindly based on emotion, but they're doing it based on rationality. Like emotion is great for bhakti, right? When you're doing kirtan, when you're doing simran, right? That's emotion's great. Then you want to become extremely emotional, right? You want to become irrationally emotional. But when it comes to when you're operating within duality, then a different mindset is required. You should become rational, right? That's what rationality is required. So it's about understanding, okay, where does different modes of thinking become relevant? And then what does that give you? And so a think tank is about a highly rational approach to statecraft, a realistic, a pragmatic approach that understands reality for what it is, so that if we understand the problem, we have a better capacity to solve the problem. Because if you can't accurately define the problem, you're not going to find an accurate solution to a problem.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point, like as a coach as well, like trying to understand how that's even applied to like statecrafting, like emotions and rationality. And they're both used in a Sikh context, but like how are they being used? Like using logic when you're doing kirtan, it's like,
yes,
you know. So I just want to go back to that context that you've laid out of like the structure of effectively in our world that we're in now is non-Jivan Mukti based or self-actualization based. It tends towards more of a control. Whereas the one you're describing, the Satyug experience, actually we have a big psychological shift or a being shift in that, okay, now we're designing something that's around Mukti. And that has two, like at the base level, that's two distinct separate systems effectively.
Yes, yeah.
So I think we also have to realize that, because when you're building a system, it's like based, one is based on Mukti and one's based on control effectively. I don't know if you agree or disagree.
And I do agree. And I think, so what we've done with the concept of Azardism essentially is try to look at various theories of governance. And try to put like, well, if we're approaching this from a Sikh perspective,
yes,
what do we prioritize, right? And for me, the priority should be related to freedom,
yes,
right? Because mukti even sort of like translates to a form of liberation in English, right? But so freedom as an idea is a really like deep concept, and I don't think we do enough of a job on the even like what does freedom actually mean, because we sort of have a very warped understanding of freedom. So even like to attain a nation state, people assume that's freedom, right? We call those things like, well, you gained independence or you've got your freedom. But really, who has got the freedom? All that's really happened is that the government you were paying taxes to before have now been released to another government that might represent you better. But you're still paying taxes, right? Somebody else is still deciding on your behalf. You still have a gun to your head and being made to pay resources. So it's not really a true sense of freedom. A true sense of freedom is an actual liberation, where an individual can literally choose from a range of options. So if you have many options, the more options you have, the more freedom you have. They directly correlate. A lack of freedom is when you have less options. So to create a free society, a society that trends towards freedom, it's about creating the maximum opportunities for people and giving them the power individually to decide how they want to live lives for themselves. So when you look at a lot of the state structures today, like governments and stuff like that, the way they operate are as monopolies and violence. There are ways of centralizing power, and it's basically sort of saying that we as the government are going to decide on our population's behalf, and you as an individual have to submit to the collective. And so your individual rights has to be moderated. Now, we do want some of that to make a society functioning, right? Because if we had absolute freedom, where I don't know, if I wanted the freedom to, like, I don't know, go shoot my neighbor, that's not going to be great, is it? But we should have some sort of system that constricts freedom. That, okay, and for me, that's the non-aggression principle. I believe that you're free to behave and live however you want to, provided it does not impede the right for others to do the same. And that should be the base law, which you can maximize freedom, but also constrain it within defined jurisdictions. So you're free to like wave your arms about, but as soon as you hit somebody else in the face, you're not free to do that. You shouldn't be free to do that. And that's where the element of justice comes in. And this is where I believe the Khalsa's duty is as well, is to come in and uphold the non-aggression principle, is to uphold a sense of justice where people's freedom goes out of hand. But a way the states are sort of structured today is that it's not about granting individuals freedom. It's about trying to reduce freedoms in society and restrict people from operating how they want to. So what we believe is that no, we should be going the other way around, where we should try and maximize freedom and then trying to find ways. Okay, well, if that's gone too far, how do we sort that out? But the general trend should be towards freedom, not anti-freedom. Whereas most states are again, the world's changed over the last 100 years, and I'm a bit of an optimist with this, where I think the world has become a bit more economically free over time. But I think there's a lot of work left to do. and some places have gone backwards. So, but yeah, I guess that's generally what I sort of feel about that. I mean, even the whole arena of statecraft, it should be treated as a playground for spiritualists. Because when spiritual people don't enter the sort of game, then it's only the bad people who are going to persist in it, who don't prioritize things like individual people's freedoms or like the ability for somebody to get mukti. Like only a spiritual person would basically value those things and want to maximize that for others. So if they refuse to play the game, then don't be surprised where you get all the bad people, bad actors playing the game, and they're deciding on your behalf.
Yeah, because their level of consciousness is just reduced to the material realm, so that's all they know, effectively.
Yes.
So, like, basically, when we're in this, so if we just go back to kind of the context that we're in now, the society, we had Dr. Francisco Luis on saying basically human being is reduced to a economic unit, effectively. So we're in this system that prioritizes productivity. Nothing wrong with efficiency and productivity, but prioritizes that over the human being's divinity, effectively. And that's very dangerous because we, like you said, we're kind of restricting that. So in this kind of context, like the UK, the US, we can see the wars that are happening now. Yeah. What is kind of problematic about the world order that we're in now, like the democracy? Because we say we live in a democracy, but kind of before we go into the Bunga, maybe like drilling down into the current order of things, what is kind of going wrong currently? Because we also don't have like a lot of beauty in society. We can see things are being stripped like that. Culture has been stripped. Narrative has been stripped. So yeah, what's kind of gone wrong there?
I think even before like going into what's gone wrong, I think we should appreciate that a lot has gone right. Like if you look at some of the statistics, like poverty has massively dropped over the last century. Like the amount of people living in poverty, obviously despite population increasing exponentially as well. Like the predictions were, people like we're gonna increase the population. There's been less resources to go around. Everyone's gonna start starving, right? But that's not really happened. And there's actually a really good website. I have to figure it out, but it shows you like the rate of people leaving poverty per hour or something like that. So there's been a lot of successes, especially technologically, that's increasing the quality of people's lives. And even like the definition of poverty has changed. Like 100 years ago, what was considered poverty is very different to what poverty is considered today. Because obviously that absolute level has sort of risen. Okay, but I guess to sort of like contextualize everything as well, I don't think enough people sort of like appreciate the shift that's happened within the last couple of 100 years with the way how human civilization is operating. So before there was a thing called like, well, I call it this, but there's an empire world order model, right? Where you had like kings and queens and like empires, all that kind of stuff. You never had this thing called a nation state. You had nations, like nations of people, but you didn't have a nation state. You didn't have this concept of nationalism. Now, nationalism is something that was kind of produced out of Europe, and it was a way basically to form a set of shared characteristics in a society that you basically form a community around of, and then you define territory that community governs. So France became this entity for French people, but that sort of like French national identity never used to exist before. And what it actually was is like Parisian culture that people in Paris kind of maybe shared, but people who might be living on the borders of France and Spain, the people on the border of France and Spain probably have more common with each other than the people in Paris. But the kind of like the way nationalism sort of works, they carve out territory that they don't sort of even own, and everyone within this territory is now French, and then they have to perform propaganda in order to really downplay the diversity in your society and promote this national identity as the highest ideal. So everything has to be arbitrated through that national identity, through this nationalism. So even religion has to conform if it wants to survive to the nation state ideal, to the nationalism. And the same things happened to us as Sikhs. So even the Singh Sabha reforms of the early 20th century, it was basically our response to a new nationalism that was being imposed on us by European colonialism. And the Sikhs basically sort of realized that, okay, if we don't represent ourselves and clearly define who we are as a people, then we just won't be represented. And a key part of this nation state world order that developed was a system of representative politics, where people would basically represent your political will on your behalf. But if you weren't actually a defining community, you wouldn't get that representation. We've been amalgamated. Oh, there's just like a little subset of Hindus kind of thing. So I don't bash the Singh Sabha guys for doing this, but I also realized that okay, a lot is sort of like there's like an element of desperation out of it. We're really trying to conform to a world order model that really isn't our way of operating. And I think this has caused a lot of bad outcomes because when you artificially suppress the diversity in your society, you end up with all sorts of bad outcomes. You end up with people lashing out, that kind of things. And the reality is that an elitism sort of occurs where those who are more aligned with the national identity, they get the more benefit in society. Whereas those are more on the fringes and prefer their own autonomy and prefer their own unique subcultures, they're the ones who are sort of like disregarded and seen as alien and also hostile to the nation state ideal, the nationalism ideal. And then again, this is what we saw as Sikhs as well in India, where Sikhs with their own unique kind of subculture was seen as a kind of threat to the new Indian nation state identity that was trying to be developed by the new Indian nation state. So that's probably the kind of like cause, the underlying cause of the kind of hostilities against the abrasion within the nation state itself. And at the scale some of these nation states are operating at, it's just unfeasible to have communities at that size and scale to be homogenous at that level. Like even within like, I don't know, a simple school setting in a classroom, you have so much diversity. How the hell are you going to get diversity at the same kind of like mitigate all that diversity at the level of a nation state? We have millions of people. You're never going to get people thinking all the same way and behaving the same way and all that kind of stuff. You naturally, like even in nature, you have a tendency towards skewing towards diversity. Everything always skews towards diversity. But something like nationalism is something that artificially suppressing nature of human beings to become homogenous. And I think that artificial suppression is basically adding all sorts of pressures that shouldn't be there. And then when those pressures kind of like blow up, and they end up blowing up quite violently in a lot of cases. So I'd put like I'd put like a lot of the blame for the way things are in the world, why like most of the wars sort of happen, the ways state oppression occurs and persists. I blame a lot of it on nationalism. Now I don't think like nationalism is completely useless and that it hasn't had any benefits. But I think it should be moderated, and I don't think it should be on the basis of shared characteristics like religion or race or ethnicity. I think these are arbitrary things. I think nationalism probably should be better formed around shared values. So things like the non-aggression principle I mentioned earlier. So like we're not all coming to a consensus on okay, we're Japanese because we look a certain way. No, we're Japanese because we all believe in each other's individual freedoms and rights, or their ability to get mukti, right? And I think if we can modify nationalism to forget race and forget ethnicity and forget all these arbitrary characteristics and actually attach nationalism and form these kind of shared ideals in society around something a bit more valuable, like people's individual autonomy and freedom, then I think you can start getting way more prosperous and better outcomes in societies. And when we look around the world, you look at the most successful nations in terms of quality of life, prosperity, etc., those nations that have actually prioritized individual autonomy and people's freedoms and rights and reduced corruption, all this kind of stuff, they're the ones that end up doing better. So places like New Zealand, like Singapore, even like Switzerland as well is a very good example. So there's a lot of these kind of things I think we should be looking at and saying, okay, that's probably the way we should go ahead.
Yeah, I think the way you kind of broke down nationalism, and I watched that video you recommended to me as well. It was like the French, and effectively it's like a manufactured ego identity. So like the farmers are giving their power away to this narrative, and it speaks to how powerful narratives and mythology is. Because if you're giving your power away to a Parisian like culture and you're believing in that story, then you've given your own autonomy away, and it's so powerful. And I stay in Glasgow, and it's like Rangers and Celtic football teams, and they're always fighting against each other. But it's like this artificial ego identity, and people are killing themselves over a football team, right? And it speaks to how powerful that is. And we're talking about the with Dr. Kamrup Singh in episode 31 about how that reform effectively changed the ego identity from a diverse culture into a homogenized culture. And I see this in corporate culture as well, like the stripping away of the individual own thinking, like how to think compared to what to think. And I think the way you laid that out is super grounded and super important. So before we, I think one last question around that would be like, why mythology, philosophy and narrative is important, and how did past civilizations craft their state around that? Because before we start to look into statecrafting, I think addressing how mythological archetypes are important. You know, I've got Satnam Singh's book. I've not finished it yet.
Yeah, I've actually got it here right in front of me as well.
I've got it here. The Road to Empire. It's great. But like, if we can like speak into that, like the role of narrative and archetypes and philosophy.
It's really important, I think, because like even nationalism is a way of doing myth crafting in your society. Because like in the start of the Azadist Manifesto, I talk a bit about orienting ourselves in terms of what actually is itihas. So we have this concept of itihas in Sikhi. I know Hindus got it sort of as well, but the way I sort of see it, like where we sort of see it being told in our community a lot of the time is like, oh, this is just history, or this is what happened. And that is literally what itihas means, as it happens, I believe, something like that. But I think it's sort of missing a lot of the nuance of what it means to have something like itihas. And for me, I break it down to three things. There's history, like a chronology of events, like what actually happened. There's an element of mythology, which is kind of the embellishment or the sensationalism of events, right? So you're sort of like adding kind of color to it or flavor, or even things that didn't actually happen, but you add it in anyway for some purpose. And then the third thing is reality. How does these two elements interact with each other in order to be applied to your own life, right? And a great example of this, I think I usually give is of Ramayan. Like everyone sort of like knows the story of like Ram, Sita, that kind of stuff. But you only really start to value it when you start seeing how, well, who's a Ravan in my life, right? Who is that golden deer? What is that concept of the golden deer as applied into my own reality? And we start saying, well, that's the Maya, that's the kind of system we're living in, that's the kind of distractions we keep getting distracted by, right? And you realize that you yourself are the Sita, and then Ram is your guru, or it's God that you're seeking, and then you're calling out for your beloved Ram to save you, because you got enticed by the golden deer, the Marich, right? And then Ravan sort of like captured you, and how you sort of like overlay that kind of mythology onto your own life is key. And that's when you actually complete the definition of itihas. Because if you don't do that part, then what was the point of reading it? Are you just reading it to memorize it? You're going to regurgitate to somebody else. Because there's like, you kind of like miss the point of doing or studying itihas. So I think mythology is extremely important because, and also having a mature relationship with it, because I think people are, especially in the West, we grow up with such rational, logic mindsets in the way the Western education systems are, that we're very highly fact orientated. We're not actually kind of truth orientated. Like when you watch Lord of the Rings, like in the cinema and stuff, you don't sort of sit there and say, "Oh, that's nonsense," right? There's no such thing as elves or hobbits, right? You know that, right? Or implicitly, you still watch it and enjoy it because there's truth in it. There's not facts in it. Like there's not a factual hobbit or a factual elf, but there is still truth in the sort of like overarching archetypes that are being sort of portrayed by Gandalf the magician or Aragorn the warrior and all these kind of different types, and how like the little guy overcomes the big guy kind of thing. Like these are kind of truths you can embed and apply to your reality. And so it becomes very important when you're doing nation building or society building or even civilization building to have your myths solid and robust. And someone in the Bunga gave a great example of this. It goes, if you start treating God as an entity you should fear, and that's your whole religion is based on a fear-based approach to God, then you're going to get a society that is highly, very like dogmatic, and they prioritize like strict observance, because in fear, if you do something the wrong way, you're going to be punished, kind of thing. But if you start promoting a society where your concept and relationship with God is a bit more loving, then you'll start to see a society that actually does love each other more and be more forgiving with each other, that kind of thing. Because these are your national myths, right? Or your civilizational myths, the building blocks of your society. So yeah, I suppose mythology is extremely important, and getting it right and having the right myths are important.
Nice. So you're talking about like the archetypes and things like that, and I think that's super important because as a coach as well, you look into the hero's journey just of the individual, and things like Lion King or like you're saying Lord of the Rings, I used to play World of Warcraft. These bypass the individual's consciousness into the subconsciousness, into the archetypical resonance of that person. So like Guru Gobind Singh, there's many facets to him, and there's many archetypes that resonates with on a vibrational level, because everything is vibration. So at least these archetypes, I think, will be representing a different frequency. And I would argue, I don't like to say West, because the Greeks had so much good mythology and the ancient Celts and things. So it's just kind of like this modern industrial, like, what do they call it? Philistine kind of approach to stripping narrative and mythology. And I think we're speaking with one of the artists, Rajpal Singh, Intrinsic Arts. And it's the first step to taking away a nation's power or identity is stripping away. It's like a cultural genocide, or it's like stripping away the culture, the art, the embellishment. So with that being said, I think that's a really strong context to start on. What is a bunga? Why is it needed? And how does it work? So I was in the Greek Lyceum, Aristotle's Lyceum, a couple of years ago.
Oh, no way.
And I noticed, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. That's how kind of Alexander the Great became great, because all of these people were basically wrestling. They were learning metaphysics, they were learning medicine, and that was paid by the government, right? They were patrons of that time. So I understand it's centers of learning for a variety of subjects like rag, kirtan, medicine, calligraphy, and come together to discuss ideas and share knowledge. So if viewers are not familiar, kind of what is a bunga, why is it needed, and how does it work?
So a bunga is a kind of like later development in sort of like the Sikh history as well. So there's no bungas during the Guru's times and stuff that I know of. What the Guru had was a darbar. So bungas basically traditionally were it was kind of residences. Misldars used to have, like, so when the Sikhs sort of like formalized into various like confederacies called misls.
Okay.
The kind of like leaders of those misls would basically visit Amritsar and Harmandir Sahib, and where they would stay, they'd establish kind of like residences. So these became known as bungas, and then later over time, these bungas kind of became like transformed into like centers of learning, or like to fulfill various functions or purposes. And so because they became like centers of learning, and like they specialize in like rag or like whatever sort of topic they sort of choose, we had quite a lot of these, but they sort of like fell out of sort of like fashion, I guess, and like during Maharaja Ranjit Singh's time and afterwards, and the whole kind of like collapse of the kind of Sikh aristocracy and the Sikh kind of like empire, that kind of stuff. We chose to like use the word bunga and stuff because we want to like revive that kind of like tradition of forming centers of learning. And so within the bunga itself, we have like various kind of functions and things that we do. Not all of it is traditional. We obviously try to adapt to modern times as well, as I believe is part of Sikh tradition to do. Like, it's actually part of Sikh tradition to actually adapt and innovate and not stay attached to tradition. But we sort of like keep the thread and keep the kind of like branding of these things as a kind of nod to it, like that's our inspiration. So we even have like a darbar within the bunga, and that's basically a space for us to connect with the Sangat and share ideas, all that kind of stuff. And we also have something called a Vichar repository. So it's kind of like our kind of like library, I guess, like available online, where we conduct our like researches and opinions and do our like contemplations, and we collect and curate that into a kind of online repository, accessible and categorized into different things. So people and Sangha who interact and want to learn from the bunga can do so in a kind of structured way. But yeah, essentially that's what a bunga sort of is. It is a center of learning, where we're trying to attract many ideas and propagate ideas as well. And the kind of like a modern kind of the closest thing in the modern times to what does that is like a research institute or a think tank. So that's why I sort of like try to blend both together by saying, yeah, it's a bunga, but it's also kind of a think tank as well, trying to get that like East and the West kind of mix kind of thing, and also modernize it a little bit. But yeah, in a nutshell, that's what bunga is.
Okay, so I'm just wondering, why is that? So you mentioned like aristocracy. If you go to a gurdwara on a Sunday, that's never talked about, right? Aristocracy, high culture, high thinking. So people listening to this might not even know what the word aristocracy is. So like, what is aristocracy? Why is that important in civilization? And how did that work in the civilization context of Sikh Empire?
So I probably recommend Satnam Singh's actually book on this. He probably gives you a better overview. But in a nutshell, the kind of like concept of aristocracy is essentially your nobles in society, the kind of like high class of the society. And the reason why I believe it's important to have this kind of elitism within Sikh civilization and culture isn't because I believe we should form kind of like a pseudo caste hierarchy. It's because the whole point of, in my opinion, what Sikh was trying to do, what the gurus are trying to do, was elevate the peasant to the status of a king and a warrior, right? So to become aristocratic, to become high society, is the kind of like point of becoming Khalsa. The Khalsa automatically elevates themselves to the status of a king. So having this high culture and engaging in high culture is actually part and parcel of being Khalsa. And the unique thing about Sikh aristocracy is that anybody can be one. It's not like restricted by lineages or birth or that kind of stuff. Although in practice it kind of was, like in the Sikh Empire times. But there's no reason why anybody who like becomes Khalsa is any less than anybody else who's become Khalsa. You're all equal in that status. It's only your own actions that define whether you're going to behave like a high class individual or you're going to behave like a low class, low intellect, low consciousness individual. So there's the kind of like that element of luxury. But a Khalsa should be in a way where they're comfortable both on like a throne and also a horse's saddle kind of thing, right? They should be comfortable in a palace and also a jungle. So the Khalsa has that kind of like flexibility to them. We shouldn't abstain one from the other. We should basically, like people say, oh, you shouldn't engage in like eating certain things that taste good. Like you shouldn't have swadras, right? And I'm like, well, why not? Are we not kings? Should we not indulge in the kind of like luxuries of reality? As long as you have an element of detachment to it. If you get obviously too much into it and then it kind of consumes you, where it's using you more than you're using it, then obviously that's a problem. But then that's why you do your meditation in the mornings. That's why you commit to Simran. That's why you do your Nama Abhyas, is so that you maintain a level of separation. The same thing we do when we sit in meditation and you observe, like, where are the thoughts coming from in my head? Like I'm sitting here and these thoughts are just popping out. Like even these words, I'm not consciously like concentrating on what words coming out next. There's sort of like a stream of consciousness coming out. And it's a complete mystery to me where these words are coming from. And if I start concentrating on it, it becomes difficult to talk. Like, oh yeah, where are these words? Where are these thoughts coming from? And it goes back to the free will stuff, where I actually know that these things are kind of appearing in consciousness. And in those states of meditation, when you sort of realize, well, no, you're not actually these thoughts. You're kind of like sitting behind them. You're kind of this observer, kind of observing the space. And it's a similar thing now when you're interacting with society. Yes, you can indulge in things and behave like, have the finest silks, finest clothes. Like, I don't know, like even I guess like back in those times, it'd be like having the finest horses, going hunting, like having a kingly lifestyle. Today, it'd be like driving fast cars, shooting guns, all that kind of stuff. But it's like, as long as you have an element of detachment from it, and then also a kind of moderation with it, confined to like things like justice. These are good things. It's just reality. It's just the world. These are part of the universe. It's part of God's creation to enjoy God's creation. But if you're going to act like a Luddite, and then it's like you're kind of like shutting up experiences for like no reason, in my opinion. But yeah, there's a very important place, I think, for Sikh aristocratic culture, Sikh high society, elite culture, because that is what the Guru was trying to do, is trying to make the common man into an elite. And that was also a political move as well as a spiritual move, because it's sort of saying, okay, no one is actually above anybody in reality. We're all equal. If they can be king, so can you be a king. And to do that, you have to shift in the mindset. So if you detest kingly things, then you're not going to be a king, right? You should have a kind of moderation with, there's a balance with it.
Yeah, that's so wonderfully put, because like it goes back to the praxis of what we're talking about, like the sadhu going to the cave and Advaita, versus if you want to live in this reality, well, you also got to win the system, which is you have to become a king or a queen mentality, right? Yeah. So what are the factors, if we just go back to the countries that are doing it well, what are the factors, for example, in Switzerland as a model that helps promote economic freedom or individuals' autonomy and empowerment? Because I think it's helpful to analyze a real life example. I was in Switzerland last year, and it was evident to me that the people were very powerful. just by themselves. I mean, just powerful in the way that they dress, the way they speak, the way they think, their own feeling of power. Coming back to UK, people did seem, a bit more restricted in their mindset and their feeling. That was just something I just noticed. So what are your thoughts on the factors affecting like human beings in Switzerland from what you've seen?
Yeah, I think even in general, so some of the examples sort of given in the manifesto are like, Switzerland and Singapore, etc. So in the manifesto, what I do is I look at something called the Economic Freedom Index, published by the Heritage Foundation, and it's a series of 12 different factors. I can't remember more off my head, but things like rule of law, freedom of like how corrupt your society is, or how much financial freedom is there, like freedom to invest in things, all that kind of different things, right? They all contribute to this concept of economic freedom, which is a subset of freedom as a whole as well. So if you don't have economic freedom, you don't have freedom. You have to have economic freedom if you want freedom as a whole, alongside political freedom, spiritual freedom, etc. Economic freedom is very crucial. So things like having, why Switzerland and some of these other examples are successful is because they allow and respect the individual autonomy of the citizens of the country. People can rely on the justice system there, right? If there's an issue where a contract has not been respected, where one side has sort of screwed over the other, they can rely on the system to help them out. But when you go to like a economically unfree country, what you always tend to find is the justice system there is crap, right? You can't rely on it, and it's like people, you can bribe people easily, or people based on their status can get away with crimes that they wouldn't otherwise get away with, and that sort of like reduces faith and trust in the system. So the reason why a lot of these countries are successful is because they have a lot of these different factors that contribute to economic freedom, mainly being that their justice systems are solid, there's low corruption, taxes aren't burdening. I think tax is a big one, actually. Although even some of these countries, they're not the Nordic countries, they're a very good example. They're quite high in the economic freedom index as well. But all these countries, it doesn't mean they're perfect. They've obviously got their own problems as well. But they are like the best examples we have. Like they still have their problems, but they're trending with the right direction. And what I was trying to do is basically learn, okay, what factors are there that are causing them to trend the right way rather than the wrong way, and then let's find the correlations between them, and see what they've got right. So this is what a lot of the Azardist manifesto covers as well, like things from inequality, taxes, minimum wage laws, all this kind of different things, and it's trying to actually replicate and find the commonalities between successful models and why are they successful. What is the logic behind that, and how can we apply that logic in a coherent way to apply to a new experiment if we wanted to do that, or to improve existing societies. So yeah, I would attribute a lot of Switzerland's success to its economic freedom, and it's also its security. So Switzerland especially is quite famous for being quite neutral. So it's become a big safe haven for a lot of people who are wealthy. So a lot of other countries, what they do is they and you're seeing this a lot, like in like UK and like US and stuff, with certain movements where they basically demonize wealth, and then they're surprised why the country is lacking wealth, right? Or why wealth is fleeing. Well, if you create an environment where wealth is attracted, then the wealth will come, and that's what Switzerland did. It created a justice system and a secure system where people who were wealthy were attracted to it because they had faith in it, they could trust it. So that's why like the Swiss banking is known, because all the millionaires are putting their money there because they know we can trust the system here. And it's common sense, really. Like if you're going to demonize something, then don't be surprised why then it moves away. And if you're to create an environment where you attract something, then don't be surprised that thing comes to you. It's a lot of this. A lot of economics comes down to common sense. The tricky part is actually how do you scale that up and actually apply it to real scenarios.
Amazing, yeah. Like we don't think about economics enough in that way as well, because even though like the Nordic countries and Switzerland are not designed around the ultimate like mukti, it's still mukti in a way on the physical domain of like the individual's autonomy and economic freedom.
So just quickly on that, actually, I mean, I think it's quite important actually to understand what economics is, because I think a lot of people have this misconception that economics is basically the study of money. And like, yes, it covers that, but more fundamentally, what economics really is the study of human behavior. Like what drives human beings, what incentives are there in society. And it's really like a very fundamental social science. It's not a hard science. And I think economics is extremely important. Like even before looking at like anything political or politic related, if you don't have a good basic understanding of economics, politics is kind of useless. because you'll end up with basically just operating based on emotion. You'll think like, oh, that these people are poor and those people are rich. I want the rich to like give their money to help the poor kind of thing. But then you don't actually understand like, well, if you did that, then you're gonna move the wealth away from your society. You're gonna give it to the poor, and then that kind of like baseline of what's considered poor then changes, and then the actual wealth generation in your society kind of diminishes, and then everyone's equally poor. And we've seen this kind of like examples happen in real life in multiple situations, like the Soviet Union and Maoist China, and even India itself has elements of this, right? And it's like you have to like, it's not about money, it's about how human beings operate fundamentally. It's understanding incentives, what drives human. It's human behavior studies. It's kind of like it's a bit like biology in that sort of sense. So yeah, I mean, like obviously money is important in economics because money does drive human beings, but it's what drives human beings that's the important part. The kind of like what drives them is kind of the secondary factor.
Mm.
And then even like actually, well, I've mentioned this for now as well, but even this concept of mukti, like you just mentioned now, the Nordic country, that they don't seem, if you go there or if you look at their governments, whatever, like they're prioritizing mukti in society. They've not got like a spiritual center set all over the place, like financed by the government. It's like because like mukti, right, and then this yearning for like spiritual progression and like spiritual excellence, it's not something you attain. It's something that's natural with everybody. Yeah. What you're trying to do is reduce the inhibitions to it. Now, there's a philosopher, Alan Watts, right, and he does a really good example of like how happiness is looked about in the West versus the East. And he goes in the West, they look at happiness as something you attain as external to yourself, so you must attain happiness. But in the East, it's more like, no, happiness is already inside you. You've got to remove the barriers to it. So the West becomes a bit more like, okay, we have to go outward and seek happiness externally. Where in the East, they started to seek happiness by doing internal inquiry, philosophy, meditation, spiritual practice, etc. Right? And it's a very similar thing then with freedom as well. Like freedom is the natural state of things. Diversity is the natural state of things. If you want more of those things, you want more prosperity and growth and innovation, then reduce the barriers to it. And then you'll start having those things. And what governments are basically essentially big barriers there, and you need some barriers, because if freedom goes too far, you'll get some undesirable things in your society. But you don't want too much government, because then they start becoming quite a barrier to success. So a good example I usually give is that you want your government to be a referee, not a participant. And if you do that, you'll end up with quite a lot of good outcomes in society that I've seen in my research so far. Hence why even the Azardism ideology we came up with was so heavily focused on, okay, if you're going to have a government, make sure it does four things. It does national defense, policing, tax administration to finance those things, and also having a strong justice system and court system. If you've got those four things, you've got all the building blocks for a very successful, prosperous society. The government does not need to do more than that. When the government starts getting more and more involved in things, then you start getting more and more bad outcomes.
Yeah, that's a really key point. And just going back to like the money and economics, like, because the way I try to understand from a spiritual perspective is like money is essentially like Shakti flowing through the society. And that's, like you said before, we understand the politics, which is essentially our solar plexus is like autonomy. It's like the root Muladhara, root chakra, which is like the money element. How we like, how do we have like a foundation in this material reality? So we have to have resources, and then we can start doing politics with these resources almost. Yeah. So it's like a natural progression of nature, of our life force. So, and I was just wondering your views on like Punjabi culture. So like in Punjabi culture, we have this kind of enmeshment, they would call it, trauma bonding as well, where the individual is not able to attain their autonomy, but they're more enmeshed. Whereas I see in the Western culture, you'd have this more hyper individualism, and it makes it challenging for a community to form, and basically a true sovereignty of a king and queen mentality to take place, because essentially you'd need to have the autonomy of an individual, but also contribute to that society. So how does the Bunga operate in kind of like helping the individual be part of a community, but at the same time not giving away their autonomy or their freedom of thought and cultivating that?
Yes, this is a really good question, and actually was the basis of an essay I wrote a while back called "The Battle of the Isms." And I recommend everyone to read it because it basically goes through my ideas of what the real kind of like two sides of the debate really is. It's not a discussion of is it individualism versus collectivism. The real discussion here is on voluntarism versus involuntarism. And so I guess to contextualize this, Sikhi is very unique in the way it approaches civilization building and society building in the kind of environment it sort of existed in. Because if you look at like places like China and even India with the Brahmin like high caste hierarchy stuff, it's very collectivist. It's like you have to form yourself and become in harmony with society. And you're more like a gear in a cog. You're kind of a cog in like in a system, and you're meant to like do your little part in that wider system, right? But if the system needs something and you're in the way, you can be discarded of. And I think Sikhi is very unique in that. Is like one of the kind of like it's very individualistic, because what individualism really is, it pertains to rights. It's not necessarily saying are you selfish or you're not selfish, which I think people misunderstand it as. So you're right. Like in the West, there's a lot of hyper individualism, but I'll probably reword that to say in the West, there's a lot of selfish nature in people. And that doesn't mean that's absent in the East. And if you look in the East, there's probably a lot more selfishness if you look at like a lot of Punjabi culture and stuff like that as well. But with individualism, what it does, it pertains to rights. Like what rights does the individual have? Like, does he have the autonomy to make his own decisions? And the way Sikhi, I think, does it is that it respects individualism more so than anyone else. Because if an individual wishes to worship something that they want to worship and the state is trying to make him do something else, well, then a Sikh should stand up for what is right. And that's what Guru Tegh Bahadur sort of did. And he defended the individuals of the Kashmiri kind of like Sampradaya, whatever they were, to practice their religion. But it's like there's no compulsion in Sikhi either. Like you're not forced to pay the swand. If you're forced to pay the swand, it invalidates it as the swand. Then you're paying taxes. Like Maharaj has never like forced anyone to like pay up, right? It's like it's your own obligation by becoming a Sikh. But to become a Sikh is your own choice. When you read by Gadashi's Baran, it sort of says you take one step to the Guru takes a million towards you. That first initial step is yours to voluntarily make. No one's forcing you to make that step. The Guru's not forcing you. So there's that implicit respect for an individual's autonomy is always there in Sikhi that I don't feel is in the environment in which it sort of grew up in, wasn't always respected. So like, especially with the sort of like the corrupted Brahmin caste hierarchy system, where if you even heard the Vedas, you'd be killed kind of thing if you're a lower caste. Like that kind of stuff just does not exist in Sikhi because Sikhi respects the individual's autonomy. Now, when it comes to like, okay, well, how do you form communities whilst having an individualistic culture? Is that what you do is that you don't have one community, you have many communities, and you give the right to each individual to decide which community they like to participate in according to their own will. So if a community is no longer serving their interests or they no longer want to participate in it, they should have the freedom to exit and go join another community that better suits their interests, what they need or what they want. And they should also have the freedom to set up their own community. So instead of having one overarching community that everyone must conform to, again, it's what nation states and nationalism did. Instead, you should have a system of systems where you create an environment which anybody can set up their own community based on anything they want to and attract like minds. And if they create situations and environments within their small community that is conducive to growth and prosperity and great standards of living that people want to move to and also participate in, then they'll start getting people migrating towards them, and then they'll set up and grow their community if they so choose to. But if they create bad outcomes and implement laws like, okay, well, if you're of this type of demographic, we're going to kill you, or if you're a type of this, then we're not going to give you opportunity, then people are not going to want to exist there. And so that community tends to stay small. And that's fine. We should get people to like create communities that they want to, and then they should grow or not grow or stay small, depending on the outcomes they produce. So I think the real kind of like crux of this is less about the conflict between individualism and collectivism. It's more about voluntarism and freedom versus involuntarism and authoritarianism. And when you see a lot of the collectivist projects around the world, they end up trending towards authoritarianism, because to maintain a community, especially as you scale up, you have to implement certain laws to make sure that community's original factors that kept it as a community stay that way. And that's hard to do when you have lots of rules and you have a very fixed and narrow vision of what you want your community to operate like. And so you are naturally against the diversity of it. So you have to impose more rules and more authoritarianism to maintain the community's kind of ideal vision that you wanted. But if you keep it broad and you accept the diversity and you allow for more freedom and individual autonomy, then your community is probably more likely to grow.
And then, like, I'm just bringing to mind a corporate example. So, for example, big corporates in America, and it's very similar to how Britain first came to India, in that they came to trade and then they started to take hold and gain a monopoly. So, like, big American companies nowadays, a lot of them don't produce their technologies. They would effectively buy other companies, kind of strip them of their resources, take that technology, and they would not make their own technology, but they would just grow bigger and bigger and get a monopoly. So even though we live in a democratic world, that kind of corporate structure, it seems like that has like a greed underlying structure because the wealth is not distributed in that way. So how do you see that model of corporatization fitting in to like this system of systems, or would that not fit? How do you see the corporate structures?
Yeah, this is a really good question, because it goes at to it really touches the heart of like what the issue actually here is. Because if we strip it all back, right, what is a corporation, right? It's a corporation. It's basically another word for community. It's a community of people coming together to solve a particular problem or aligning their interests in a way to serve a particular purpose. That's what a corporation or an organization, again, an organization of people, a company of people. All these words we call these businesses are basically just different ways of saying community. And the highly organized communities, they tend to have hierarchy structures, because in reality, hierarchy structures tend to get most things done quite quickly. When you have very flat structures, when it's kind of like a very democratic, where everyone gets a say and that kind of thing, it's very slow then, because there's not like anyone sort of guiding it. Now, for better or for worse, the hierarchies are faster and they make decisions faster and they get things done quicker, but they might also get the wrong things done quicker. So like if a company's making the wrong decisions and is a hierarchy structure, then it would fail in a natural sort of setting. Now, when you look at examples like of these multinational corporations that go to like various like developing countries and sort of like monopolize and take over and set up their sweatshops or whatever, what you're not seeing there is basically that these aren't operating in good faith, like in an actual capitalist system. So what they're doing is they're operating in mixed economies where the governments of those countries tend to already have a pretty poor justice system structure in the first place. And also the politicians there can be quite easily bribed and lobbied and all that kind of stuff. So what the corporations do, they don't just set up shop and they start hiring people and producing goods and services at a cheaper cost than they would in their own host countries. Because if that was the case, loads of companies would come and they'd all take the cheap labor and they'd start producing all sorts of stuff, right? But you only tend to get like a handful of these big companies coming in and they monopolize it. Now, the reason this happens is because we've got to understand, how do monopolies actually form in reality? Monopolies don't naturally form because it goes against nature. Because in nature, again, if you remember, right, it naturally tends towards diversity. It doesn't trend towards monopolization and centralization. It tends towards decentralization. So when you go to a jungle, right, a jungle is not just one tree. It's actually loads of species of trees, loads of biodiversity, loads of animals, insects. It's an extremely biodiverse environment. And it's the same thing with markets, right? If you leave markets alone, you end up with lots and lots of diversity, because anyone can enter the market, anyone can identify the problems in the market, and anyone can establish their own solutions to solve those problems. The issue becomes when you have a monopoly on violence in the market. So somebody in the market is basically deciding who can participate and who can't. And in reality, what that is the government. So in these developing nations, the governments tend to be quite strong in terms of their monopoly and violence in the nation. So when a big company comes in from outside their nation, they go to the governments and they form these kind of contracts and get in bed with the government. They buy out the politicians, they get the lobbying, they get the licenses, they get all these kind of like unique benefits that no other company can get. And they basically effectively monopolize themselves by legislating themselves in and then enacting barriers to entry for anybody else to come in and do the same thing. Now, who does that screw over the most? The people, because the people now have less options. And as you remember, less options naturally means less freedom. So if there's many, many options to choose from, the people who are the actual workers in these factories or whatever, then they could basically then are in a better position to negotiate better pay, better working conditions, that kind of stuff. Because if this factory is factory A is providing low salary and low working conditions, but factory B is providing a higher salary and better working conditions, then factory A must increase its working conditions or increase its pay in order to attract the talent that it wants from the country. Now, when you have not just factory A and B, when you start having factory A to Z and have all many, many hundreds of options, now the workers are much more in a better bargaining position because they have lots and lots of options to choose from. They're not confined to just one option. So when you give them lots of options, now the companies have to actually perform better and offer better incentives if they want the actual workers. So if you look at a lot of these developing countries, what's happened is there's little options because the companies that come in, the big companies, have bribed the government to basically enact laws and regulations and different types of barriers to prevent other people coming and competing with them. And that's a complete. It goes completely against the kind of economics and politics I'm for. And I got a whole chapter in the Azardist Manifesto which talks about how monopolies form and how to prevent them. And the root thing that I say to prevent them is actually reduce the power of the government to actually enact these barriers to entry. Stop getting the government being able to be bribed, like put an end to this kind of like corporate political activity culture, put an end to this lobbying thing, because that way then the companies come in, and if they want to hire people, then they've got to provide incentives to them that are better than their competitors who are also equally able to come there and hire them. So that's kind of my sort of answer to that. And also with the democracy thing, I'm pretty against democracy because I just see democracy, especially direct democracy, as a form of mob rule. It's a way basically of saying, okay, whoever the majority decide, that kind of decision is then imposed on the entire population without their consent. So if I voted against 100 of my peers, and then the 100 basically then, I don't know, demolish my home because it's in the 100 people's interest, well, I see that as unjust, right? And you can see sort of examples of this where like in China, they're building a highway and there's a guy who doesn't want to move out his house because obviously the highway is going over his house. So they're trying to build around it kind of thing. It's like, well, yeah, because you have to respect that guy's time. That's his house. If he doesn't want to move, you can't force him. And that's the kind of individualism I'm talking about that I think Sikhi respects. And I think democracy disrespects, because democracy is a way of saying, okay, well, look, whatever the majority decide, that goes. And if you're the minority, well, screw you. The majority wins. The majority is important. And I think that's a very bad way to operate societies. And I mean, Socrates was calling this out 2,000 years ago, and still we have this mindset of now democracy is sort of good. Like, no, I don't think it is. And even the founding fathers of the US, they recognized the pitfalls of direct democracy, and that's why they established a republic instead, where they have a constitution that ensures each individual a certain amount of like inalienable rights. So these rights, in theory, should not be voted away by a majority. Like you can still have democracies and votes and that kind of stuff, but those votes cannot affect somebody's individualism. And that's like a good compromise, I thought. And like even now, if we are going to implement some of the systems I'm talking about, they probably would go down a similar route where we have a constitution that assures certain rights to every individual. Like the issue with America was that they didn't give these rights equally to everyone. Like Black people, Native Americans, and women didn't get the same rights as like rich white landowners. And obviously they did improve over time, fine, but I think by then it was a bit too late. They implemented a central bank, etc. But despite all that, they were still probably one of the most successful experiments in statecraft we've ever seen in human history, because they had this system of actually ensuring that individual rights should not be triumphed. Yeah, so that's some of my views on like democracy and monopolization and that kind of thing.
Yeah, because a lot of people, viewers, like maybe our generation, they might find themselves in a big corporation and they might say, hang on a second, I'm working for a corporation where I feel a bit stuck and a bit and this basically has a monopoly and you don't really know what's going on. So I think it's important to have that context and be astute in that way. And also it takes away from the concept of savalak. So like if you have that, then how can you be savalak? Because it kind of goes against that. And I remember there's one quote that came up on Instagram. It was like by Osho. It was like, democracy is for the people, by the people, but the people are retarded.
Because democracy basically means government by the people, of the people, for the people. But the people are retarded.
It's like, okay. So I like what you said as well in one of the interviews, which was like, people should be cultivated, or they should have a degree of responsibility to be able to vote. And I thought that was quite interesting, because it takes away from the psychosis or the mob mentality of what could happen. Basically propaganda.
It's definitely, it's an improvement to it. Like, if you want to vote, it should be a skill that you hone, not something a birthright. And this is what Socrates was saying as well. Like, if you are using an analogy, I think of the ship of fools. I think it was his analogy, right? Whereas, like, if you're on a ship, right, you don't want anybody coming in. Like, you have a big boat. You want only the skilled people who are actually skilled in like shipcraft and like sailing, all that kind of stuff, to actually make the decisions of how the ship should run. Otherwise, you're all going to sink, right? And it's the same thing with the society, with the nation. Like, you don't want to just let anybody decide like how the nation should be operating. You want those skilled in statecraft to decide. So if you want to vote, you should earn the right to vote, right? And even then, I don't think that solves the problem, but I think it is an improvement. Because I think fundamentally it's still mob rule. You shouldn't let others decide on your behalf. I think you should have a system of rights and a system of justice, which ensures that if your rights are ever breached, then you can take it to the highest authority in the land to have basically justice done. And then everything else, let people decide for themselves, form their own communities. Within the communities you form, because it's voluntary to participate in, you can decide whatever legal system or decision-making system you want. Like, if you want to implement a democracy in your own community, fine. I mean, that's what we do with our friendship groups. If we want to decide where we want to go hiking, we all do a vote, right? Oh, I want to go here, right? And then we okay, a cool majority kind of thing. But the reason why that's not unjust is because we're all voluntarily participating in that, right? Like, we're not forcing them to go on a hike if they don't want to go there. It's like there's private democracies and private governance models are fine. Like, even having private monarchies are fine at that point, where you have private dictatorships. And this is essentially what our gurus were. They were private monarchs. We all volunteered to follow the guru, and the guru was basically our monarch in that sense, right?
And like,
but it would be unjust if the guru was a state entity where it's like, I'm the monarch, and now you all have to follow me by force. And if you don't, we're going to send a death squad to your house and kill you. And you have to pay us this amount every month, that thing. And that's what the governments are. That's what governments do. They have monopolies and violence in your community.
Yeah, so it's like the whole frequency of that civilization is based on love versus fear, because one is tyrannical based and one is based on love and voluntarism. And that reminded me, I think, Satnam Singh's book. It was like the Mughal, a lot of Mughal painters or artists would actually go into the Guru's court, like Switzerland, because they felt safe there to actually then do their artistry, and maybe later they became Sikhs. But that's the same model as Switzerland. And I think the Stoics said, like, the thing is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape the ranks of the insane, which I thought was quite powerful. So I just want to go into this. So you're talking about the systems, a system where different systems can occur, like in a decentralized way, to see what can be working and what essentially collapses. So how does this Misl mindset or Misl way of working and structure basically uphold Dharma? Because that's what we're essentially trying to do. So how does this, people might have not even heard of Misl if they're coming from a secular background. So if you could explain what this is, how this worked in the past and how this could work kind of now. This probably goes to the limits of kind of like the cutting edge of Azardism as well. Like, this more of their experimental ideas now, but to put into context, Misl essentially were these they were essentially these princedoms that kind of developed after the last Guru Gobind Singh sort of left, and he also made the Khalsa, the Guru, as a collective. So the Khalsa, who were learning from the Anandpur darbars, learned a lot about statecraft in a kind of monarchistic empire kind of world order model kind of thinking. But then the Guru sort of like threw a bombshell and said, okay, well, now you're all kings. And they're all trying to reconcile now, like, well, if we're all kings, what does that mean? Like, how do we set up a society or a civilization or governance structures if we're all kings, if we're all equal? And the kind of like conclusion they sort of seemed to come up with was this idea of a Misl system, where, like, cool, we have the benefits of having a hierarchy and a king structure and the kind of like benefits that come with that.
But we don't just have one king that rules over all of us, because no one is more king than anyone else. We'll just have a system where you have many of these kings, and they form their own groups called misls. And I don't think they called themselves misls during that time. I think that's a later thing that we start attributing to them. But essentially, these look like confederacies and kind of like autonomous kind of units who took over various regions in Punjab, and they imposed a tax, a Raki, or kind of protection tax, and they basically provided the defense for the people within their jurisdiction. That's largely what they did. I mean, they had like they patronized the arts and like helped the society here and there, but they were largely quite minarchist. Like they were kind of like hands off with this, as far as I understood it. And they're primarily focused on basically just like justice and defense and protection, and then also then they tended to sometimes fight with each other over like territory and tax rights, whatever. So that's essentially what they were. They were a system of governance Sikhs developed quite early on. There's like 13 of them, I think, off memory, and then one of them, like towards the western side of Punjab, they were sort of ran by this one misl who got fed up by the Afghan invasions, that they were taking the brunt of it. So they sort of like went and did this process of centralizing the misls into a unified kingdom. And that guy came to be known as Maharaja Ranjit Singh, to set up the first Sikh kingdom. Now, I personally think that was a mistake. I don't think they should have done that, because now they put all their eggs in one basket with this one guy. And then they sort of rely on the competency and the benevolence of this one guy and his sort of like small group around him to administer the kingdom in a way that's effective. So and to his credit, he did a very good job. Like, it was a very, very good, successful system. But again, it relied on him. So as soon as he came out, sort of like went off the scene, the system that relied upon him also collapsed. So obviously, I'm simplifying it. Obviously, various factors like betrayals, all this kind of stuff, and then obviously the internal mismanagement, the lack of succession planning, etc. Right? But again, all these factors can only have an effect if all your eggs are in one basket again, right? But if you had a system where you decentralized it and you kept it a bit more, okay, well, if that one kind of falls, that's fine. We still got a bunch of others to like fight back, whatever, and they're all autonomous, whatever. Then any kind of invading force, they've got to find it way harder now to topple many units that are kind of aligned against you versus one unit. And then if you take that out, then you solved it, right? You solved the problem. You've got the whole thing. And this is one of the reasons why the Taliban was so difficult to defeat in the Afghanistan, because they weren't necessarily this one unified force. There were a bunch of different tribes with their own sort of like structures and hierarchies, etc. So like, yeah, you might like take them out in one region, but there's like 15,000 other regions you still got to take, and it's like have a whole new war each time. Like Baghdad, the same sort of thing when the US invaded Iraq. It was like each house was like a fortress. Like there's like weapons everywhere. Like it was like you had to clear everything. So it's like it's so resource intensive for any invading force to do that, and it kind of puts them off at a certain point. Like, okay, well, we're not dealing with that kind of like hornet's nest over there. So it sort of forms a kind of layer of protection. So like from an Azadist perspective, from my perspective, it was like, well, I like the decentralization of the misls more than like the centralized format of the Sikh Empire. Because one, I think, is more philosophically consistent with what I think Guru Gobind Singh Ji's vision was, to decentralize the guruship amongst the Khalsa as a whole, and where people can actually decide for themselves which hierarchy they like to join voluntarily, and if that hierarchy, that misl, no longer has a mutually beneficial relationship, they can leave and join another misl or even start their own. That, I think, is philosophically better from a Sikh and Khalsa point of view. Versus actually centralizing all the power into one guy and then hoping he'll be all right. Especially when we're going backwards by doing that, because we already had centralization with the guru. And if you're going to centralize again, it's essentially saying that, okay, that guy has now become like more guru than everyone else, kind of thing. Like, if we have to be subordinate to him, then what does that say about my autonomy as an individual? And this is why even during Maharaja Ranjit Singh's time, like the Khalsa would not respect him a lot. Like they'd actually scare Maharaja Ranjit Singh quite a bit. And there would actually be a good counterweight. And it's probably one of the reasons why the Sikh Empire was so successful. It's because it had a kind of a good counterbalance to prevent complete autonomy, complete authority. So it became quite good for that reason. So what I believe then, a modernized rendition of this, taking the lessons here, is that I identified that the missile system before had two major problems that made it susceptible to being centralized in the first place by Maharaja Ranjit Singh. The first thing, there's not enough of them, right? There's very few missiles, only 13 of them. That's a handful. Whereas I'm thinking, right, you don't need 13 missiles. You need probably like 13,000 or even like 130,000. You need thousands and hundred thousands of missiles, and various sizes and solving various problems. And the only way you can do that is that if you reduce their kind of reliance on, well, basically you make them no longer region based and you make them no longer tax based. So instead of what missiles used to do, where they'd go over to a region, take it over, and then like a mafia charge protection racket instead of a protection racket and charge everyone protection tax. Instead, what you should do is actually just find clients who volunteer to pay you, like a subscription service. Like, let's say I now want to have my neighborhood secure. I should be able to pool funds with my fellow neighbors and say, well, look, there might be bandits or thieves and stuff coming to rob our houses. Let's put money together and let's hire that missile over there. I've heard they're good. They can come in and they can do patrols. And then another person might say, well, okay, look, I'm running a company on this street, and I want my cybersecurity to be pretty good. He's going to hire like a cybersecurity missile. Whereas another one might be hiring, like another household might want to hire a missile that specializes in bodyguards. So like they might want to say like they're probably working full time something and they can't have time to take their children to school. So let's hire like a missile to help them create a safe like school walking thing, right? There's a bunch of different ways you can do it. Like the same way we have like everyone in a household has like a mobile phone subscription to a different provider. You can probably have many providers, security providers you're subscribing to in your household. And I think this is probably a more just way to actually operate as missiles, because you're not relying on taxes, which is theft, which is literally putting a gun to someone's head and saying, okay, if you don't pay me, we're going to kidnap you and throw you in a cage, right? Instead, you're saying, okay, look, we offer this service, and if you want it, this is what we charge. Or they can even do it the fund base, where they say, okay, well, we as missiles, we're going to protect your area for free, and then you just pay us what you want to, right? Like how much you think we value, kind of thing. So it's a voluntary payment structure versus a tax structure. And it's very important to make the distinction between taxes and the fund, because taxes is involuntary payment. And the proof of that is that if you stop paying taxes, see what happens. And this fund is a voluntary payment. And the proof of that is that if you stop paying this fund, see what happens. Right. And then, so I think the missile should operate on a disfund or a voluntary payment basis. And they also should forget trying to secure and monopolize regions and say, okay, this is our territory, no one else is allowed in it. Instead, no, cooperate and coordinate together. And maybe in a single city-state or a single town, you might have hundreds of missiles operating, serving many, many different clients. And you basically kind of like interlace and you form a network of security by having so many security providers offering bespoke security services to the citizenry there. So yeah, that's essentially what I believe for a modernized missile system.
Yeah, because no monopoly can form, and essentially you don't have any control of what your tax goes to, right? Where it funds and things like that. So, and what? But
look at the police. Look at the police service today, right? If the police, right, today, if they're underperforming in some area, you can't like say, okay, well, I want to stop paying my taxes to the government so I can pay a security company to patrol my neighborhood instead. Right, you still have to pay the taxes to pay the police. You really have one option here. But with this system, it's like, no, the police aren't doing a good job. I'm going to stop paying that police service and pay this police service over here because they do a good job. So now the police sector has an incentive to perform, because if they don't perform, they ain't going to get paid.
Yeah, okay. So it's like that flower, like you have that flower inside of that organization, but you also have the thorns outside. It's giving people that thorns. So just before we go into the Stanistan model, which I'd love to explore. What came up for me is also when I was listening to some of Guru Gobind Singh's shabads and on war and stuff as well. It's like metaphysically, what I feel is like it's like creating a backbone to be a king, but not essentially giving the Purana or the instruction of like how to do it. So it's like almost that structure or backbone or like steel of like that backbone, and then it's kind of like up to that how that life force wants to express out of that. That's just intuitively how I feel.
That's a really good way to put it.
So I feel like that gives individual sovereignty, but still, it's just like you got to have this backbone first.
Yeah.
So if you could help explain to us how you're really setting the foundations of Miri Piri to be manifested in a modern context, and what is this Stanistan model, system within systems kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. So Miri Piri obviously is this idea of a temporal nature and also a spiritual nature, and sort of how they reconcile in reality. And this is what I think Sikhs are unique, and why Sikhs are unique, and what they should be here to do is actually format these Miri Piri experiences and manifest them in the world. Now, the Stanistan concept is an attempt to do this. So it's part of so it sort of exists within a wider framework called Azardism. Azardism is a kind of political economic ideology that I made up to basically encapsulate my ideas on freedom as applied to economics, based it on Sikhi and Khalsa ethos, etc. And it's meant to be a guiding philosophy on how you'd actually perform statecraft from a Sikh perspective. Now, a lot of Azadism is primarily focused on performing, how do you actually reform a nation state, or you start a nation state from scratch and make it successful. But if you start taking the Azadist sort of like ideology to its limits, and you really push what freedom can do, then you end up with a kind of like a very anarchist society. So the whole thing probably should be better sort of seen like on one end of the spectrum is communism, where you have complete state control, a complete authoritarianism. And the other end you have anarchism, where you have no state at all, zero state. So the more towards communism you go to, the more authoritarianism you have, right? And the more towards anarchism you go to, the more libertarianism you have. So Azadism is a kind of philosophy that's skewed towards libertarianism, but it doesn't always go all the way to the end of no state. It does cover that position, and this is what the Stanistan starts to do. It goes, okay, well, if you start saying, okay, well, let's not have a centralized state government at all, how would that society sort of function? If I'm sort of saying, okay, the state's bad at doing this, the state's bad at doing that, the state's performance of bad incentives, the state's all the kind of stuff I'm blaming on the state, then why do I give the state some of the most crucial functions like policing, national defense, justice system, and tax administration? So the Stanistan stuff was an experiment to sort of see, well, okay, if you even decentralize that element and you start saying, okay, well, maybe there shouldn't be the central government having a monopoly on violence, and actually people can sort this out for themselves in their own collectives. How would that look like? So the Stanistan sort of thing arose as an experiment in our thinking. Okay, well, if you take this to the limit, what would it look like? And a stan means quite literally a land. So you have like Pakistan, Hindustan, Afghanistan, whatever, that kind of stan thing kind of refers to a land. Now, the reason why I call it Stanistan is because like Afghanistan is like the land of the Afghans kind of thing, right? And Hindustan, the land of the Hindus kind of thing. But with Stanistan, what I wanted to do was make a land of lands, a system of systems where people can actually form their own communities voluntarily based on characteristics or values or whatever they want to do for themselves. And then those systems will compete with each other on the basis of providing good quality of life for people. So those systems that are able to produce the best governance structures, they can basically perform the best to attract the most talent to their societies. And those talent will then contribute to the society to grow the society further if they so choose to. And you can also form societies based on particular topics or themes. So you might have a society devoted to, I don't know, like education. We have some forms of these already, that would be like campus towns. Or you might have a society devoted to entertainment, like Disneyland, right? Like Disneystan. So you might have stans devoted to, like, I don't know, working and producing like outputs into a particular type of manufacture, or residential stans where you want to live, or retirement stans, like places you want to live when you're old, that kind of thing. And then during the course of one's life, you might not even stick to one stan. You might want to like change your stans as you age, or as your situation changes, as your priority changes, as your interest changes, etc. But the key is to have many, many stans and many, many options for people to choose from. So if a bunch of communists or Marxists say, okay, well, Marxism is best, we believe in having a socialist style commune, what I would say is that, okay, well, try it, right? Here's your freedom. You should try it and show us that works. Whereas another group might say, no, we believe in capitalism. We believe that You have to have like free markets and all this kind of stuff, and that's what produces prosperity. And then what I would say is, okay, great, try it, right? So these teams will come together, they would pool funds amongst each other, they would attract investors, they attract donations, etc. They'll buy some land and they'll basically set it up from scratch. And then over time, we can see from a range of experiments which one of these experiments is more successful for their own stated success metrics. So, like, even having this idea of what success is, it might be different to each person. That's not an objective measure either. Like, some people might think, oh, success is having a life where I can eat healthy food. So the commune might be set up to basically focus on organic farming, where another person might say, like an eco village kind of thing, right? And we have examples of these as well in small pockets as well around the world.
Yeah.
Whereas another person's definition of success might be actually earning a lot of money so they can drive fast cars. Now, we shouldn't be in a judgmental position about people's own definition of success. Like, if that's what he enjoys in life, I mean, he's here to live life as much as anybody else and enjoy life how he wants to. Let him do it, kind of thing, right? If it's not harming another person. So he might join a stan and set up a stan that is more conducive to setting up outcomes that best match his goals. And then Stanistan respects that people have different goals and way they want to live and express themselves and live their lives. And so we give them the maximum opportunity to do it. And then we also see from the experiments, okay, which ones end up being the most successful and communicate that so that people then understand, okay, well, if I want this particular outcome, I know what type of system to employ. We don't get that normally now because we are stuck with one option, and that one option imposes that kind of system on everyone arbitrarily. And then we don't really have much choice within that. And then unless you're trying to move country. And there's only, like 300 countries. Again, it's not enough diversity, not enough experiments being run. And then what Stanistan does is actually say, okay, well, let's form thousands, if not millions of experiments in this. And then we'll quickly iterate and find solutions to very, very different answers and probabilities, etc. And what types of stans are most conducive to particular lifestyles that people want. But the only limit on this is that one stan can't negatively impact another stan without their consent. And that's where I believe the Khalsa missile system comes in. That goes, okay, well, if that stan over there is pumping out toxic chemicals in the local river, and that's poisoning a stan down the river a bit more, and all their food supplies got poisoned, well, then that's a clear breach of consent, because that other stan did not consent to having their food poisoned. And this stan has over here pumping out the toxic chemicals is performing an injustice. And that's the role of a competent Khalsa formatted in a modernized missile system to come in and put an end to that and enact justice. So that is what basically how I envision a kind of free society that balances justice, but also individual autonomy and freedom, and also collectivism for people to form communities based on what they want, rather than what's being imposed upon them by a single system of government.
And how would you get the power in the first place to be able to develop a system where all the systems can manifest? Because obviously you'd have to do a pilot first where people would have to opt in to do that. So would it be like a pilot process that would roll out in a grounded way where people would opt in locally? And then, how would that work in a grounded sense? Because there's a lot of like philosophical and like political and social engineering. Like you're laying out the work for that first. But in practicality, how would that start to manifest to actually get the power of the system to create the systems within the systems?
To create the systems. So what you've just asked now is something I call a implementation question.
Yes.
And as you might know, I avoid implementation questions publicly because my general mindset with this is that if people want to get somewhere destination-wise, we first have to agree on where we're going, right? Like if I wanted to go to Shepherd's Bush Gurdwara, I give this analogy a lot, right? But if I want to go to Shepherd's Bush Gurdwara, I don't just put London in the map. I have to give a very detailed positioning on the map, right? And then only then can I calculate the route. And another thing I need is to understand where I'm starting from as well. So when you've got the start point and you've got the end point, only then can you calculate the route. So what we're doing publicly now as a Bunga is at least doing the prajar and where we're trying to head to, like really detailed, flesh out the destination. But what we do in private is actually do a lot of this strategizing and how do we actually get to that theory. And we do have strategies and plans that we've developed. We have a bit of a 100-year plan as well we've developed, and we're progressing as well behind the scenes. But a lot of that stuff we don't want to make a lot of noise about at the wrong times. And we're trying to do it in a way where hopefully our results start speaking for themselves rather than us sort of like lecturing about it. And then there'll be opportunities for people to get involved and actually make this vision reality. But again, enough of us have to agree publicly on where we're trying to head before we can have public conversations on how to get there. So it's more of a private conversation at this point. So yeah, I kind of dodged your question there, but it's for good reason. I've dodged it.
So if people, as we slowly begin to wrap up, if people want to get involved with this, read the white paper, attend the darbars, and if there's anything else we missed in the conversation, would you like to point them in that direction, and also let them know kind of anything that we've kind of missed in this conversation that you could update them with?
Yeah, great. So we have a website called azardism.co.uk, azadism.co.uk. And on there, you can read the entire Azardist Manifesto, which outlines the philosophy of Azardism. And you can also visit our Bunga page on that website, which basically goes into the think tank stuff. And it gives you all the information how to get involved, how we operate, etc. We also have our Vijar repository on there as well. So if you want to visit and learn a bit more about the Stanistan concept alongside things like, okay, how would a death penalty work as per Sikh principles? Or what's the role of the Khalsa? What's the status of the Khalsa? The mindset of the Khalsa? And even spiritual topics. We've got things like logical fallacies for Sikhs, that kind of things. Lots of things in there. You can all visit that, or you can visit bungaazadi.com as well to go straight to the Vijar repository. And if you want to interact with us a bit more on a closer level, we've also set up a Bunga Azaadi Discord server as well, which you can find on the website, etc. as well, or through our Instagram, Bunga_Azaadi on Instagram. We encourage people to interact with us and engage with us, because we're not trying to set up an echo chamber here. We're trying to actually seek disagreement actively. And the more disagreement we can get in a professional manner, respectful manner, the better we can stress test our ideas and replace our bad ideas for better ideas. Nothing here is fixed. No one here is above questioning, especially not the Bunga members. The Bunga members themselves don't always agree on everything. We encourage the debate and disagreement, because if we set up a situation where we're all just being yes men, we ain't going to get anywhere. We're going to be lying to each other, deluding each other, and then not actually achieving anything. We've got to be actually quite accurate with what the reality is. And the only way we're going to be accurate with what the reality is if we do vigorous debate and vigorous research, and honest, and be humble when we're wrong as well. So yeah, challenge us, engage with us, do so respectfully. And we have all the avenues in which you can interact with us and engage with us. Become a member if you like to, become an associate of the Bunga if you want, etc. Lots of opportunity.
Nice. Yeah, and that's something we're talking about, like dialogues or debate. I feel like dialogues are like healing, debates are like for construction, right? So I really appreciate the work you guys are doing. I'll go and check out one of the bars as well. But yeah, I'll put all the links in the description below so people can check out Instagram white papers and your Discord server. Thank you again for your time. I really appreciate the work you're doing. And keep it up.
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Hajjal Singh. Yeah, and it's great you're doing all these podcasts and interviews as well with all this wide range of people. Like this is more of what's needed. So I really appreciate having me on and the work you're doing as well, Hajjal Singh. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you, and thanks everybody for taking the time to listen.